Okay, our presentation today is psychology, and it must be a science because it ends in ology. So, and many of you already know Professor David Meyers from Hope College. He's been there on the faculty since 1967. That was a long time ago. Professor Meyers is author of multiple psychology texts, as well as dozens of scientific writings in both academic journals and general audience magazines. He received a master's and a PhD from the University of Iowa. So without further ado, please welcome Professor David Meyers.
Thank you, Bill. And it's always a great pleasure for me to come here to HASP, where I have so many friends and we're talking to friends about things that I'm passionate about and love dearly. So thank you all for being with me. And I've been invited to give you a little tour of what we've learned from the last half century or so of psychological science. But first, I need to acknowledge that psychology has received a lot of bad press, and you may have read some of this. There's been, as every field, medicine, law, academia has people who are dishonest and who present data that actually turns out to be fake data. And that has happened in psychological science as well. We also have what's been called the replication crisis, which is that some famous studies have trouble when repeated producing the same results. You may have heard of the famous Stanford prison experiment by my colleague and friend Phil Zimbardo, or the Robbers Cave experiment by Muzaffar Sharif, a boys camp experience, a kind of tribal experience in which it's alleged that maybe these investigators kind of stage managed the results that they got, which are harder for others to replicate. And then there are other findings having to do with supposed effects of brain training, implicit bias training, of learning styles, which I'll say a little more about a little later, which turn out to be, they just don't work. I mean, it's just, I'm sorry, and they've gotten massive publicity and application, but there's null effect. And then there's some famous studies that sometimes replicate and sometimes don't. The power of teacher expectations, the self-enhancing power of posing. I'm going to say a little more in a moment about the facial feedback effect, and I'll say a little more later about the claims of seasonal affective disorder, otherwise known as wintertime depression, which I'll show you why I think doesn't exist. And then we have other famous phenomena dealing with stereotype threat. That is what happens when people of color are reminded of their ethnicity in a particular testing situation, or growth mindset, or the famed marshmallow test on children's ability to delay gratification, which turn out to be somewhat replicable, but the effects are pretty modest. And so as a result of all that, some people looking at psychological science respond cynically. I took a high school psychology class whose entire content was all of those famous experiments that have turned out to be total horse bleep. I studied this. They made me take an exam. For what? I'm putting all my chips on neuroscience. I refuse to listen to psychologists ever again. They had their chance. Imagine if you'd spent 10 years getting a PhD in this stuff, going into $200,000 debt. You can learn more from life, never mind a psychology lesson. Just take a look around, fella. Whew. And then the Onions, the satirical magazine, satirizes the majority of psychological experiments in the 1970s were just crimes. In most cases, they were conducted simply to inflict pain and distress on their test subjects. Whoa, that's pretty hard stuff. That's my discipline. My discipline that I love and have been reading and reporting on for the last 40 years. But consider, first of all, how science works. And we were reminded of this by Anthony Fauci's testimony to Congress recently. It's a learning process, and it's always growing and always changing. It's self-checking, it's self-correcting. And the process clears out the weeds. And I've identified some weeds, and I'll show you some more that we've been able to clear out. Also remember that with science, as with mountain climbing, the upward march always comes with occasional downward slopes before you head back up again. And in response to that, we adjust our teaching and our reporting accordingly. And so the CDC has, for example, in the advice it gives regarding protecting ourselves against COVID. At the same time, some phenomena that I've mentioned are genuine phenomena, but they're specific to a situational context. And one example is one of my favorite experiments in social psychology. It's called the facial feedback effect. If you hold a pencil in your teeth, it activates the smiling muscles, and people who do so find cartoons funnier and feel happier than if they hold a pencil in with their lips, which activates the frowning muscles. And in other ways too, if we can manipulate the body into happier, sad expressions, it has a carryover into the emotions. Well, there were some experiments that didn't replicate that, but those experiments all were videotaping people, making them self-conscious and kind of distracting. If you replicate the experiment as it was originally done, it works. So that would be an example of a situation-specific result. And we also have the fact that a lot of phenomena do replicate successfully. The Center for Open Science replicated 307 different psychological science phenomena and found that 64% of them, about 2/3, replicated successfully. So what endures after we clear away the chaff? What remains to teach? That's like everything else that fills this top row of books, my introductory psych books. And so you might ask, what's in those books? What are the big ideas? What are the take-home lessons after you forget the details that are life relevant and that you hope your students are going to take into the rest of their lives and never forget? Well, as a quick overview, what I'm going to offer you today are kind of 3 sets of findings. The first I consider unsurprising. They won't shock you, but they're important. They're highly replicable, and they're important for students to remember as they live their lives. Second set of findings, or the second and third set of findings, I think you'll find surprising. At least they're not things I believed when I took introductory psych 60 years ago. And some of these findings simply astonish us with new insights that weren't available to us during my college years and most of yours. And some of them actually challenge our beliefs. I can't believe that's true, but it is, and it's the way it is. So we might as well know the truth. So that's the overview of what I'm going to share with you today. Starting first with some findings that seems to me, important to know about, even if they're not terribly shocking. So number 1, there's continuity to our traits, our temperament, and our intelligence across the entire lifespan. With age, we become more emotionally stable. We become more conscientious. This is all good. If you've got teenage grandchildren who maybe aren't displaying emotional stability and conscientiousness, be patient. Their frontal lobes will mature, and they will change. And yet, individuals differ from early childhood into adulthood in things like their personality, their aptitudes, and so forth. And those differences persist, although in somewhat different form, maybe over time. Here are data from a famous study that was initiated in Scotland some years ago when researchers discovered in a closet in Edinburgh the results of a simple intelligence test that was given to every Scottish 11-year-old back in the 1920s. And so they had a whole national sample. Every kid in the country took this test. And then they went back to them 80 years later and gave them 60 years later, 70 years later at age 80 and gave them an intelligence test. And here you can see the striking positive correlation between their cognitive aptitude, their measured intelligence at age 11 and at age 80. So there's stability to personality, to temperament, to intelligence. And yet at the same time, we've also learned that we have some distinct cognitive abilities. Each one of us is somewhat better at some things than others. And yet underneath all those diverse cognitive abilities is a common intelligence factor that's called G, for general intelligence. So some of you, like maybe you recall taking the Scholastic Aptitude Test. Maybe you did better on the math portion, or maybe you did better on the verbal portion, or maybe you have gifted spatial abilities. And those are distinct cognitive abilities. And yet there is a common core that's called general intelligence. That's something we've learned. We've learned, no news to you, that rewards shape behavior. And of course, we've learned this from some famous experiments with pigeons and rats. And we see it demonstrated in the natural world. as animals as well as people gravitate to rewarding experiences. I wrote another 500 words. Can I have another cookie? Casinos use the power of intermittent reinforcement, which leads people to be very resistant to extinction, as Harvey will remember from his day studying introductory psychology, because that was part of the lesson that he had. We've learned that cultures differ in important ways and shape each one of us in simple ways, like how we dress, how we eat, how we speak, how we sound, I mean, our accents and so forth, and in our values. And so we live in a nation, for example, that is the most individualistic nation on earth. Other communities, particularly in the developing world and in Asia, have more collectivistic, more we thinking as opposed to me thinking, driving their values and their priorities in life. And so this is a cultural difference that's been extensively studied. We're unsurprised by the remarkable power of conformity and of social contagion of behaviors. And so there are certain fads, of course, that erupt at different times, and dress fads. Tattoos are currently a fad that are spreading. And this shows up in some very simple social contagion experiences. If one person yawns, other people are more likely to yawn. If one buddy is hilariously laughing, it has a way of generating laughter across a whole room. That's social contagion. And by the way, we see this, I mean, this is a really interesting kind of debated issue now in the dramatic increase among teens-born girls who during their teen years are identified as transgender. I mean, that's you know, so is this a social phenomenon? Is this and if it is, to some extent, how does that affect our support for people with transgender identity? That's a very controversial topic. I cut my eye teeth in social psychology doing research on group polarization. And what we and others found is that if you take people and group them with like-minded others, as we did in one experiment with high school students who were either high or low in prejudice, then inviting them to discuss some racial scenarios. After they discussed those issues, those practical situations with like-minded others, they tended to become more extreme. And thus, after discussion, as you can see, there was greater polarization. When we did those experiments, little did we anticipate how the internet and today's social media was going to put this phenomenon on steroids, as people tend to friend and to connect with and seek out information from views that are akin to their own. And, you know, you don't have to be embarrassed about this. I do this, you do this. What cable channels do you watch? What internet media do you follow? They tend to be people that are in your tribe, reinforcing what you and I already think. And as a result, polarization in society has greatly increased. The percentage of people who hate those in the other political party has never been higher than what it is right now. It's dramatically increased in the last quarter century. The share of Republicans and Democrats who say the other people in the other party are immoral, dishonest, and closed-minded, as you can see, has dramatically increased just since 2016. So we're unsurprised that nevertheless, despite these cultural differences and these social phenomena, yet we're kin beneath the skin. We're all members of one species. We engage in groups, we laugh, we cry, we have funerals, we have religious rituals. There's a whole long list of ways in which how we sense and perceive the world, and we'll see more examples of this, is all the same. We're more alike than different as humans, even though it's always differences that capture our attention. Differences from those in our immediate environment, differences from us and other culture. But if we were to compare it to species from another planet, we'd be struck by how incredibly alike we all are. And we're unsurprised by phenomena that cross cultural lines, like in-group bias. This research got started in some famous experiments in which people were arbitrarily assigned to different groups, say, depending on which artist work they preferred. And once they're kind of arbitrarily assigned to be blues or greens, let's say, then if they're given some rewards to distribute, they tend to favor their own group, their own people, even if their own group is defined in a very trivial way. And we call that phenomenon in-group bias. And evolution, it makes some sense that evolution would bias to be supportive and protective of our own tribe, our own people, our own neighbors against threats and enemies from the outside. And so this is a very kind of natural biological disposition. We're unsurprised by, again, another thing that cuts across all humanity, the power of perceptual set. You know about this, but it really is quite striking, some of the demonstrations. The character in the center here is either a B or 13, depending on which sequence of stimuli you present to people. It's amazing how people slow down when you point a hairdryer at them, thanks to perceptual set. Or consider this guy holding this kind of repugnant thing, or consider this guy who's about to punch you in the face. This guy's angry. This guy's like, ugh, but it's the same face. It's the same guy. All we varied is what his arm is doing. So perceptual set has a very powerful way of kind of driving what we see in the world. 2/3 of what we see is behind our eyes. We're unsurprised, but we certainly learn how true this is, that the way we explain the good and bad events that happen in our lives has a way of affecting our emotions and our risk of depression. Some of you are optimists, some of you are more inclined to be pessimists, or as my wife would say, realists. I say pessimist. And so what happens when something bad happens? Maybe a sales call doesn't result in a sale, or a relationship fails, or your team loses, or whatever. If you're an optimist, you tend to think, well, yeah, it's temporary, it's a setback, and it's very specific to this situation, this particular sales call. And it's not me. This guy really wasn't attuned to what we were trying to do. Whereas a pessimist will take the same experience and interpret it, explain it in an entirely different way, such that it's permanent, it's an indication of what's always going to be true, it's universal, it's me. And as a result, they tend to be prone to depression. No one wants to be around me. Will I ever get a job? I don't know what to say to people. And so these explanatory styles are really powerful. And part of what cognitive therapy does is help to change people's ways of explaining the events of their lives. You're not surprised to know that we prioritize basic needs, starting with basic physiological needs, as Maslow long ago reminded us. And once those are satisfied, we gravitate to wanting to be safe, and then to satisfy our need to belong with other people. We're not surprised that extreme childhood deprivation or abuse leaves fingerprints in the brain. Nurture matters. You'll recall the famous primate deprivation experiments that could not be repeated today by Harry Harlow and his colleagues at the University of Wisconsin, showing enduring effects on these poor monkeys that were deprived of normal maternal care. And we've seen this correspondingly in Romanian orphanages, where children were deprived in cribs for 2 or 3 years, and deprived of normal maternal care and paternal care and language exposure. And indeed, children who were not exposed to language during their first several years will never, in their later years, become fully fluent, because childhood experience and nurture is crucial in the early years for the development of language. By the way, that's why children who are to receive cochlear implants in order to go from deafness to hearing need to get those cochlear implants very early in life, before their brain loses the ability to process that auditory information. We're unsurprised, but it's an important lesson, that our behavior and our traits are influenced by many genes, each having small effects. And so if you ask, is there a gene for intelligence or sexual orientation or autism, the answer is no. There is no single smart gene or gay gene or autism gene. Rather, these things are genetically influenced, but it's many genes that combine together to influence even a trait as simple as height. There are a few exceptions. I'm going to be back here on Wednesday talking about hearing loss and the wonders of hearing. I had the privilege to serve on the advisory council of the National Institute on Deafness, representing Americans with hearing loss. And I got to know a medical geneticist at the University of Iowa who tested my spit after he saw my audiogram and could report to me the single gene mutation that is responsible for my familial hearing loss. But that's an exception. So that's just a set of, I mean, you didn't come here for this. You came here for something a little more interesting than this. But these are things we teach our students and want them to take into life. Important, replicable findings that help us understand our human nature. But more interesting are some surprising findings. First, some things that are pretty astonishing when you stop to think about it. They're things that I wasn't taught when I took introductory psychology, but we now know to be true, even though they don't necessarily challenge any deeply held beliefs. But they're just things that we never imagined. Great lessons of psychological science, I called them, that are now accepted wisdom. You're probably familiar, for example, with the split brain studies that were done in the 1960s and 1970s, showing that our two brain hemispheres serve some rather distinct functions. The normal, well, almost everybody has a corpus callosum, a band of a couple 100 million neural fibers connecting the two hemispheres so the two sides of the brain communicate. But when those two hemispheres are separated in animals or in humans to alleviate severe epilepsy, we see some really interesting results from the separate functions of those two hemispheres. That's something we've learned. It's pretty astonishing and pretty important, but we didn't know it before. When I went to college, and probably when you went to college, we didn't understand the nature of sleep as we do now, and the distinct sleep stages that occur, and when various kinds of mental imagery, including full-fledged dreams, appear during those sleep stages. We didn't understand about the extraordinary malleability of memory. We have a whole set of experiments now on what's called the misinformation effect, in which you could plant false information. People have experiences. They're eyewitnesses to something, and then they're given a suggestion later or an image later, and this would happen naturally in a police interview, for example, and they end up being entirely convinced that they've seen something which they have not seen, and thus they give false reports. And of course, that can be false reports of things maybe parental abuse that they appeared in, occurred, sexual abuse in early childhood, which some therapist helps convince them is responsible for their current problems, even though that's a totally false memory. We've been surprised to learn what does work as therapy, like electroconvulsive therapy as a very powerful treatment for otherwise irremediable depression. I mean, why should that work? We didn't have a theory as to why that worked. There was no expectation, but it has. Or light box therapy for depression, or more recently, microdosing psychedelics. I mean, like 10 years ago, when this first came on the horizon, is like giving people psychedelic drugs. I mean, that's a terrible thing to do. I mean, that's destroyed a lot of lives. How could that be therapeutic? But now we have massive news experiment. This is a huge area of current research on how very small doses under supervised conditions combined with therapy can provide rather prompt relief from depression for at least some people. And we've been kind of surprised to learn, I think, what doesn't work. Critical incident debriefing for trauma victims who are immediately after a tragedy, after witnessing a death or a horrific tornado that's taken down their house, put through counseling that helps them relive the experience. It turns out to do more harm than good. Or what was popular in police departments across the United States, DARE drug abuse prevention programs with kids, which turned out to be, if anything, negative. It's certainly not positive. And many studies have consistently found it just didn't work. Or attempts to sexually reorient people who are attracted to their own sex and who wish they weren't. Turns out, most clearly so for males, as I'll explain a little later, that just doesn't work. You are who you are. Or efforts through non-biological means, enable people who are significantly overweight to lose weight. People can lose weight on weight loss programs, but they almost always gain it back, most of it back. So those are kind of surprising things. And then another thing we didn't appreciate when I took introductory psychology is our two-track mind, what we call dual processing. Our thinking is partly controlled and conscious and deliberate, and is partly, and in fact, largely automatic. Freud had the idea that the unconscious mind was huge. And turns out he was right, although the unconscious mind is very different. We're talking about some cool information processing processes, not the kind of unconsciousness that Freud had in mind. My colleague Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner for creating behavioral economics, who died this spring, his kind of magnum opus, one of the great books of psychological science of the last century, which I highly recommend, describes his research on dual processing called thinking fast and slow. Thinking slow is controlled, deliberate thinking. Thinking fast is the automatic, out of sight thinking. We call it system 1 and system 2 for thinking. And it shows in some really kind of weird phenomena, like blind sight, sight unseen. David Milner, was a chair of the psychology department at the University of St. Andrews, where I spent a sabbatical year and got to know him. And what blind sight studies find is that the visual processing system operates on 2 tracks, conscious and unconscious. And this is evident in people who cannot consciously see the world and yet can navigate in it. And so if somebody's walking down the hall and you place an object in their path, they won't see it, but they will navigate around it. Or if given an envelope and told to put it into a mail slot that's at one angle or another, they'll say they can't do it. But you say, go ahead and try, and they'll get it right. It's like there's a zombie within. There's an action track that's enabling perception to affect behavior, even though people cannot consciously see or experience what their body is experiencing. So that would be an example of blind sight, of dual processing. And then there's phenomena of implicit memory. Memory too operates on 2 tracks. There's conscious, deliberate memories, and there's unconscious memory. And this is demonstrated with some famous patients like HM. You may have heard those initials. It turned out his name was Henry Molaison. And he was somebody who early in his adult life had a brain injury to the hippocampus that destroyed his ability to form new conscious memories. And so he could remember his past life. He was a very intelligent person. He could converse. But if his doctor walked into the room, he wouldn't recognize her. And she came back the next day and she'd have to reintroduce herself. He could not form new memory. By the way, my father had this experience at age 92. He had a brain bleed that destroyed his ability to form new memories. Completely lucid and intelligent. Could talk about his whole life history. But he might ask what we're doing for dinner. And 15 minutes later, he'd ask again. I mean, and yet these people who cannot form new deliberate conscious memories can form new skills. They can learn how to play games or solve puzzles. They could deny that they could solve that puzzle, like the Tower of Hanoi puzzle, how the order in which you stack blocks and so forth. They could deny that they could do it. They've never seen that before, but try it. And they do it like a practice expert because they've learned and remembered information that they don't know that they know. We all know so much more than we know what we know. I mean, they can learn to ride a bicycle or something. And then I earlier said that research on implicit bias training has proven that in corporate settings or Hope College trying to do this with employees, it's just not very effective. But implicit bias is real. Prejudice operates both at a conscious and at an automatic kind of knee-jerk level. So that there's lots of evidence for that. And that would be another example of kind of dual processing, our attitudes towards other people at both a conscious and an unconscious level. And then, of course, there's all the thinking we do without conscious thinking. And you've experienced this many times when you've tried to solve a problem or recall a name or whatever, and then you give up and fruitless, but an hour later or after a night's sleep, suddenly you have an insight and it's there. Your cognitive processes, your dual processing is continuing to work outside of conscious awareness. Another recent line of recent research that it surprised me and how reliable the effects have been, because we've got lots of experiments on this now. It's called the testing effect. And by the way, if you're interested, my publisher has created a little 5-minute animation, tinyurl.com/how-to-remember, where I explain this. But the phenomenon is such that if students study, let's say, a chapter in a textbook, for example, how do they best remember that? How do they best prepare for an exam? Is it to reread the chapter and then to reread it again? No, That is not the best way. The best way is to read the chapter and then start testing yourself and finding out and rehearsing that knowledge and finding what you know and what you don't know. And so self-testing turns out to be a much better way to learn and retain information than does rereading in experiment after experiment. So that was kind of surprising to learn that. Here's another one that has actually made its way into popular lingo. You've perhaps heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect. I mean, this is another one of my, David Dunning, who's down the road at the University of Michigan, has done research on the amazing extent to which people are ignorant of their own incompetence. Those most incompetent, for example, in experiments, those scoring low on grammar or logic are most likely to overestimate their knowledge. Or as comedian Trevor Noah put it, this is the problem where the dumbest person in the room thinks they're the smartest person. And I'll let you think where that might apply. And but some examples. The less you know about genetically modified foods, probably the stronger your opinions may be about it, and vice versa. Or the less people know about vaccine technology and vaccine science, the more likely they are to have some very strong and misinformed attitudes about that. By the way, just to give you a little practical example of that, in national surveys, it was one of the ironic findings that unvaccinated people feel safer, more protected against COVID than vaccinated people. More protected people feel less protected. The Surgeon General recognized this. Vaccinated people may, not just may, they do overestimate their peril. They're too scared of COVID, just as unvaccinated people are too little, have been too little afraid of COVID. And so CBS News asked, were you concerned about the COVID Delta variant? Those fully vaccinated, 72% were still scared. Those not protected against it, only 48% were scared. The Dunning-Kruger effect, ignorance of our own ignorance. We've been surprised. I mean, this has just like been shocking, and it is now a matter of national discussion, but surely you tuned into. The explosion in teen mental health, it can only be genuinely called a crisis. Here's the percentage of people that have had a major depressive episode in the past year in government national health data among those who are 50 years old or more, among those who are in their early to adulthood to midlife, and among those who are 18 to 25 and 12 to 17. And as you can see, since about 2011 or 2012, there's been a dramatic increase, as seen here in another survey, in depressive symptoms. And we're talking about self-cutting. We're talking about emergency room visits with threats of suicide and so forth among teens. And this is especially among teen girls. And it's all been since, it's in the last dozen years or so. Leading Tyler, Tyler, my friend at Harvard, who's an epidemiologist, to add, by the way, a Dutch guy who's going to come here and speak for us at Hope College sometime, to ask, what's happening here? 20 years ago, Tyler Vanderweel, his name is, 20 years ago, life satisfaction surveys showed young adults having the highest readings, the best mental health. Now, a Harvard-led study examining a dozen measures of well-being show younger adults tallying the lowest scores of any age group. Today's teens and young adults are in a bad way. And as I mentioned, it's more true of girls than boys. This is the percentage of those high in depressive symptoms. And as you can see, again, this is University of Michigan National Survey done through 2022. Dramatic increase. All the data are showing this. All the data are showing this. And again, especially for girls, but also to a lesser extent for boys. So what's going on here? We now have a convergence of evidence showing that, well, one thing that happened during this last 15 years or 12 years is the spread of smartphones, teens spending several hours a day staring at a screen instead of being with other kids doing stuff and comparing themselves with one another on social media. And it turns out in correlational studies that if you look at across teens at how many hours per day they're spending staring at a screen, the more hours per day, the more at risk they are of having mental health issues. This is true in the UK as well, as you can see, particularly so for girls. As you go from up to 5 and more hours per day, the risk of girls being depressed approaches 40%. So that's correlation across individuals. We also have longitudinal studies that look at when social media and smartphones came into a particular culture and what happened in the time sequence of the rise in depression system of depression after that. And it turns out that that's a kind of, it works out that we just follow lives through time, that the mental health risk follows the introduction of the social media. And we have controlled experiments in which people are volunteer to be in the experiments, and some of them are put on a social media diet, if you will, or even abstaining for a few weeks, and then we see how that affects their relationships and their interactions with people. All of these things together, and we have some quasi-experiments too of a rather large sort. So all of this stuff together makes it look like the phone generation is paying a price along with all the benefits of today's smartphones for 2 or 3 possible reasons. One is what you're doing when you're on social media is you're comparing your own lives to your friends, and your friends are showing their lives at their happiest and coolest and most attractive, making you feel kind of bleh by comparison. Also, if you're spending 4 hours a day staring at a screen, that's 4 hours less doing something else. It's less sleeping, and kids today are sleeping less time reading, and especially less time with other kids. And so the daily average time that people spend face-to-face, which is what nature has designed us for in relationship with other kids, has among 15 to 24-year-olds, as you can see, the blue line, dramatically declined since the advent of smartphones. 2012, 120 minutes a day, down to barely 40 minutes a day. That's a huge change in a very thin slice of history. And my friend and colleague, John Haidt, New York University social psychologist, has recently written a wonderful book, The Anxious Generation, if you want something to read or to get your grandkids to read. It's been #1 on both Amazon and New York Times, and it's beautifully written, and it summarizes the data, and it makes a credible case. He does have critics. And by the way, his compatriot in assembling these data, Jean Twenge, is the co-author of my social psych text. So I know both these people, and they are very open in welcoming criticism, welcoming divergent perspectives, and not everybody agrees with them. But I've read the arguments and the back and forth, and I have to say, I'm pretty persuaded that the phone-based childhood, as opposed to the free play-based childhood, is making a significant difference. Okay, those are some, we've looked at some unsurprising but important findings. We've looked at some surprising findings that are, I mean, it's like, wow, to me, I mean, they don't kind of challenge our basic beliefs, but they're still pretty kind of cool and new to me. Last set of findings is maybe the most challenging because it takes things we believe and says that's just not true. The opposite is the truth. And let me give you a few examples. So perhaps the biggest one is the first one. And I'll unpack this for you. Within the normal range of environments, what's called the shared environment effect, which includes parental nurture. The effect of the shared environment on a child's developing personality and intelligence is nothing. It's nil. And how do we know that? We know that from behavior genetics analysis, which comes to us first in the form of adoption studies, which reveals that typically 2 adopted children are hardly more similar in their temperament, their personality, and their intelligence than either is to other children down the block. And we know this from twin studies. And one review has aggregated more than 3,000 studies to 15 million twins, finding that across all traits where we've done behavior genetic analysis, the average heritability, that is the differences between individuals attributable to genes, is about 49%. But it's the rest of the sentence that I called your attention, the data are inconsistent with substantial influences from the shared environment. What? The shared environment, including the parental nurture in which children grows up, do not, like a potter shaping clay, mold a child's personality and intelligence and temperament? The answer is no. Robert Plowman, the great British behavior geneticist, had put it this way: we would essentially be the same person if we had been adopted at birth and raised in a different family. Now, if that doesn't shock you, I mean, I don't know how to shock you, because that counters everything we believe. Now, I hasten to add some qualifications to that. First of all, I said within the normal range of environments. So if you have an extreme environment, abuse, neglect versus a loving home, that makes a difference, as we've already acknowledged earlier today. Secondly, we do have data that stable co-parenting is a good thing. It at least correlates with children's flourishing. Children with who are stably co-parented by two married parents are at less risk of various kinds of disorders and delinquency, and that's even after controlling for the educational level, the income, and the race of the parents. So it's not, a good home is a good thing, but the range of good homes doesn't correlate much with anything else. But it doesn't correlate. It does correlate with some things. It doesn't correlate with temperament, personality, and intelligence. But it does correlate with people's values and beliefs. So you very likely share some of the values and beliefs that were part of the home in which you grew up, and your children, you hope, do to some extent share yours, because those things pass along. Parental nurture matters for that, and parental nurture does one other thing. Parents do one other thing, and that is they provide the peer context in which their kids grow up. Kids are very strongly influenced by, in fact, evolution has designed them to be sensitive to their age mates. They're the ones they're going to have to mate with, ultimately do business with, and so forth. And so they're much more attuned to picking up the values, the cultural tics and everything of their age mates than they are their parents. By the way, a nice illustration of this: if a parents move here from South Alabama to Holland, and they raise their children speaking deep South accent, but their children hear Northern U.S. accent, what would their children sound like as adults? Will they speak South Alabama, or will they speak Holland, Michigan English? 100% they will speak the way their peers speak, not the way their parents speak. We're very sensitive to our peers. So parents, by giving their kids a peer context, what schools they send them to, what neighborhoods they place them in, what churches they go to, and so forth, that matters. Parents do matter for values, beliefs, for peer context. Anyway, that's the first thing. It's like, wow, I never would have believed that. Or here's another one. When I was in college, I thought sexual orientation was a moral choice. And some people made perverted choices. Shame on them for doing so. But we now have just massive data that is not the case. I was wrong. I've changed my mind. Sexual orientation is a natural disposition that it's influenced by our genes, which has some controlling influence both on the prenatal hormones during the second trimester that help shape sexuality and affect the way the brain developments, and then along with some other things we just don't know what they are, affects people's disposition to be attracted to either those of the same sex or a different sex. And this is most clearly so for males. Females' sexual orientation is a bit more fluid, but still pretty much a natural disposition. So what about the effect of parental nurture? If parents of a new baby born yesterday at Holland Hospital were to come to me and say, Dr. Meyers, you're this dude who's been reading psychological science for the last half century. Tell me, what can we do to influence the sexual orientation of our child? My honest answer would be, I don't know a thing you could do. And I don't think anybody does, because the evidence is, and so, by the way, if you're happy with the way it works out, don't give yourself too much credit. And if you're not happy with the way it works out, don't lay too big a guilt trip on yourself. It is what it is. And by the way, we've seen kind of the naturalness of sexual orientation and some other kind of interesting, strange results, like gay men and women's traits of various sorts appear intermediate to those of straight women and men. That's kind of a complex sentence, but let me give you an example. Here's spatial ability. If you're given a spatial ability test that asks you which of the three target figures in the bottom row can be rotated to match the figure in the top row. That's an example of a spatial ability test. I don't know what this is good for, but maybe it's putting, I don't know, suitcases in a trunk or something like that. But it turns out that there are very few traits on which the genders differ. Men and women have the same average overall intelligence, but women are a little better at a few things and men are better at this by a half standard deviation, as you can see. Gay men and lesbian women are exactly intermediate on average between men and women on this trait. I mean, that's not a moral choice. That's just part of reality. And the fact that our sexual orientation is naturally disposed and enduring means that it's very hard to change. And so one study of 1,600 Mormons put them through a sexual orientation change effort and later checked back to see how it was going. And as you can see, overall, 0% of those attempting change reported an elimination of same-sex attraction, and less than 4% reported any change in sexual orientation. So you are who you are, and that's part of, and we all have a deep need to belong. And we've come to understand, thanks to Jim Brownson at Western Seminary and others, that the scriptures really don't as a whole teach what I used to think they taught. And so that has certainly changed my attitude. It's led me to write a book 20 years ago, subtitled The Christian Case for Gay Marriage. Okay, that was a surprise to me. Here's another one. I want to come back. I mentioned this earlier. And that is, what about seasonal affective disorder? You've all heard about this. Maybe you've thought about this. Does it exist? It's part of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders. Psychiatrists believe it and diagnose people with it. But what's the evidence? Several years ago, not long ago, some researchers took data from 34,000 people in the United States surveyed by the CDC and asked about their health. And they asked, is depression more common in the United States around the winter solstice? The answer turns out to be no. Is it more common for those living in cloudy areas? Is depression more common in West Michigan than in San Diego in the winter? The answer in this CDC survey of 34,000 people is no. Is depression more common on cloudy days? Is it more common in higher latitudes in northern Michigan than in southern Texas on winter days? Answer is no. It's just not connected. There are people depressed in summer and there are people depressed in winter. If you're depressed in winter, you attribute it to wintertime depression and darkness and seasonal affective disorder. I decided to check this out myself. And by the way, I just did this this last week. I went to Google Trends to see what people are searching for. So what about basketball? Here's the frequency of people searching for the word basketball across the last year up until last week. And as you can see, that goes up in November and then peaks in March during March Madness and then precipitously drops off. That's what you'd expect because basketball is seasonally related. What about flu? Again, flu is seasonally related and people are searching more for that in winter than in summer. So what about depression or sad? It's just not associated with time of the year. And so that fits perfectly what these people were finding from the CDC research. I haven't convinced the new co-author of my introductory psych text that we need to take wintertime seasonal affective disorder out, but at least we acknowledge there's controversy. Psychiatry still has it, but personally, I think it doesn't exist. It wasn't what I expected, but facts are facts, and if one is proved to be wrong, one must just be humble about it and start again, said my favorite detective, Miss Marple. That seems to be true. Here are some other things. What about learning styles? You've heard that maybe that some people are kinesthetic learners, some people are visual learners, some people are auditory learners, and so we need to teach people according to how they best learn. Turns out that's just not true. You just can't identify distinct learning styles and have better learning when teaching is appropriate. Daniel Willingham, who's, I think at Duke, great researcher here, has found it's a myth. Another researcher done by University of California, San Diego analysis of all this research concluded that at present, there's no adequate evidence to justify incorporating learning styles assessments into general educational practice. Sorry, this doesn't work. I've also been fascinated by this phenomenon, and I must say a little surprised by it, and that is the extent to which people fear the wrong things. For example, fearing air crashes more than car crashes, fearing terrorism, fearing immigrant crime, when immigrant crime, by the way, is about half the level of native-born American crime, fearing school shootings. A majority of U.S. teens fear a shooting could happen at their school, and most parents share their concern. And schools are spending billions of dollars to secure themselves against mass shootings and terrorist threat, even though the risk of a child dying is many times more driving to school or of a gun in the home than it is a gun in the school. Shootings happen in schools, and they capture the news and our attention. But you got to remember how many schools there are and how many kids there are. And so if you run the data, school is really a very safe place to be compared to home or on a bicycle or in a car on an American highway. Take flying versus driving, for example. Gallup has found that only 40% of people fly without any anxiety whatsoever. And yet, mile per mile, we're 500 times safer flying than driving. In the decade from 2010 through 2019, nearly 250,000 people died in vehicle accidents, and 14 people died on plane accidents. I'm flying to Dublin, Ireland for a meeting this weekend, and I believe these data, and they affect me emotionally. The most dangerous part of my journey is the drive to the Grand Rapids Airport. Once I'm in the loving care of Delta Airlines, I will relax. The air is the safest place to be. By the way, knowing, however, that people fear the wrong things, they fear flying so much more than driving. I made a little back of the envelope prediction, which got published in an Association for Psychological Science newsletter. I said, if we now, after 9/11, we're flying much less because we were afraid to fly because of the terrorists taking down those 4 planes. If we now fly 20% less and instead drive half those unflown miles, because we're going to drive to Florida for spring break instead of fly because we're afraid of flying. Given the greater fatality rate on highways than in planes, we could predict that terrorists would kill an additional 800 Americans on our highways indirectly in the ensuing year. I didn't think, I'm embarrassed that I didn't think that prediction could actually be checked. And so 2 years later, a German researcher, having read that prediction, got the US accident fatality data and checked it out. And here's what he found. First of all, this shows you the average number of people killed on American highways per month in the years 1996 through 2000 average. So it's about 3,000 people a month die on Americans' roads from vehicular accidents. Now here it is for 2001. Remember, 9/11 was September 11th, 2001. So it tracks right along the same, except you get to right to the end, and we had 353 people, too many died on America's highways because they were afraid of flying. And in fact, he extended that a year later, and it ended up being like over the next year, kind of like 1,500 Americans, an additional 1,500 Americans were killed by the terrorists after 9/11 by making people afraid to fly, and driving so much more often killed them. Anyway, kind of surprising, cool findings. All right, here's a couple more here. We're nearing the end. There's a lot of studies that have done big, massive interventions to try to help people. A lot of well-intentioned efforts. One 30-year follow-up took like 1,500 or so kids who were at risk for juvenile delinquency, half of whom were put into a special program. They were given a big brother, they were given after-school tutoring, they were given counseling. And you went back to them years later and asked, did that program make a difference? You got glowing testimonials. Absolutely. Changed my life. It made all the difference. But if you compared those two groups and you looked at the arrest rates or the employment rates or whatever in those two groups, there was no difference whatsoever, despite the glowing testimonials of how beneficial it had been. And yet at the same time, we have some new research on what are called wise interventions that use some psychological principles and to change the mindset of at-risk, like 8th graders or entering college students, and find that some very brief interventions can have demonstrable effects on raising their grade point average in their school success and future life success. That's like kind of good news. Where most people are surprised. In fact, even when I show the data, people won't believe it, and you may not as well. But random data are much streakier than people expect. If you flip a coin when you go back to your home afterwards 50 times, you'll find more runs of heads and tails in there than people will expect to see if they're asked to simulate what a random sequence might look like. And this plays out in sports, and it leads people to suppose that that streaks that happen must indicate something other than randomness. So if a player has made 3 shots in a row, the teammates are more likely to feed that player. The coach is more likely to keep that player in because that player has the hot hand. And yet it turns out that it doesn't really exist. That is, in studies of college men's and women's players, of NBA players, of free throw shooting. I mean, these analyses have been done over and over again. If a player is a 50% shooter, they have about a 50% chance of making their next shot, regardless of whether they've made or missed their last 2 or 3 shots. The immediate preceding performance gives no statistical clue to the next performance. I meant to include a slide here. Steph Curry, greatest basketball player. I mean, I just absolutely love Steph Curry as a person and as a player. Was told about these data and said, obviously, these researchers don't know what they're talking about. I mean, when you get hot, the basket, it just grows. I mean, it's just there, and you're in a zone, and it just goes. And anyway, I read that, and I wrote, by the way, there's a recent analysis that looked at NBA data and so forth and found that the hot hand doesn't exist. So I asked the researchers, could you look at Steph Curry's data? And they wrote back, they analyzed like it was like thousands of Steph Curry shots. And what do you know? Steph Curry, the more shots he's made in a row, the less likely he is to make the next one. Steph Curry does not exhibit a hot hand. He's just so good, he makes several in a row because that's how good he is. Anyway, that would just be an example. And there's so many other examples of people misperceiving random data and finding order. My father lived in a retirement home in Seattle, like Freedom Village, and he called me up one time and said, David, I don't understand it. People, die in bunches. I mean, we go 2 months and nobody dies. And then in October, 4 people died. And I said, Dad, that's the way it is. Random data are streakier, and you don't have to have no explanation is needed other than pure randomness. And by the way, I'm happy to talk about that or debate any of these issues. Or, by the way, when we're done here, to talk about how we digest all this psychological research and create textbooks and all, if you're interested in that. Okay, nearing the end here. Reality is often quite different than what we perceive it. And you've seen a lot of demonstrations of this, but some of these really are mind-blowing. Like this one, square A and square B are exactly the same. When I first saw that, I mean, I knew this, okay, this is just a demonstration of a contrast effect. I had to cut that baby out, cut those squares out, lay them alongside each other. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? And I'm telling you, believe me, those 2 squares are the same. Reality is not what your eyes are telling you. And here we have a turquoise circle on the left and a green circle on the right, but it's the same circle. Reality is sometimes different than what we're predisposed to see. Or here we see we see triangles, an outline of a triangle and a black triangle. Those triangles don't exist. They're illusory triangles created by the rotation of the figures around them. By the way, if you think that what's on that sign there said Oxford in the spring, that's not what it says. It says Oxford in the spring, but you perhaps saw what you expected to see. We're surprised that repression, which we were all taught probably back when we took introductory psych, basically doesn't exist. We have the idea that some terrible thing happens, a trauma happens, and the human mind, to protect itself, banishes that thought from awareness drives it into the subconsciousness. That's kind of the axiomatic foundation of Freudian psychology. But it turns out that's not what happens in real life. Experience some horrific event. You're raped, you've experienced torture, you've survived the Holocaust, you've witnessed the death of a parent firsthand by a murderer, you've had your home destroyed by a tornado. Think of the worst things you can imagine. All of those people remember it. In fact, they're haunted by it. Many of them have post-traumatic stress disorder, which is defined by the inability to forget, the haunting memories and flashbacks that keep coming. As John Kilstrom at University of California said, dozens of formal studies have yielded not a single convincing case of repression in the entire literature on trauma. And that's why in this day and age, when there's so much misinformation about so many things, it's now more important than ever that we know what the truth is. I realized as I was coming to the end of my talk, I was going to do a demonstration with you today. I brought the materials and then I forgot to do it. So you're going to have to believe me when I tell you what you would have observed if I'd done this demonstration. This is so cool. I do this every semester teaching introductory psych. Harvey may remember from very long ago. It's a demonstration of what's called the hindsight bias. Some of these things, once I've told you, have a way, once you know what the truth is, they have a way of seeming true and obvious. Just like election outcomes. Once you know the result in November is, or once you know the outcome of the stock market trend or whatever, after the fact, it's very easy to explain that and to think it's obvious. And it was inevitable, you know? And if a team wins, well, it's like they're the better team. The coach made brilliant decisions. And if the team loses, you have a different, and it was obvious the coach made some stupid calls or whatever. And in psychological science, we call this the I knew it all along phenomenon. Once a research study or an election or investment, once its outcome is known, it seems foreseeable. Like everything I've described to you today is like, well, duh, I mean, of course. My grandmother could have predicted that finding. I mean, after the election, Hillary was a flawed candidate. The market was due for a correction. After the fact, we're very smart. Life is lived forward, but understood backwards. Now, this is the demonstration I was going to do. I brought the materials. I remembered to bring them, and then I don't know where they are. Oh, they're under the podium here. So I was going to hand out a little slip to you, and it was going to start saying, social psychologists have found that whether choosing friends or falling in love, we're most attracted to people whose traits are similar to our own. There seems to be wisdom in the old adage that birds of a feather flock together. Half of you, the person on either side of you, was going to have that sentence end, whose traits are different from our own. There seems to be wisdom in the old adage that opposites attract. I was going to ask you to explain whichever result I gave you, and then to tell me whether it was a surprising or unsurprising result. I can tell you when done with psychology students on the first day of the semester, 96% of people will say, well, duh, that's an unsurprising finding, no matter which they're given. And so I'll tell them, well, compare with your neighbor. If you were given the opposite finding, you would have told me that was true. It turns out, by the way, that birds of a feather flock together. That's true in many ways, and in almost no way, apart from maybe masochism and sadism making a wonderful marriage, is it true that opposites attract. But I said, baby, if you thought that was obvious and unsurprising, or if the person next to you thought that was obvious and unsurprising, and you're going, what a dimwit sitting next to me. Remember that I think I've just demonstrated, had I given you that finding, you would have told me it was obvious. So psychological science works. It affirms important truths, some of which are unsurprising, but it's important that we know about them. Sometimes it surprises us with discoveries that astonish us, sometimes with findings that challenge our assumptions. And thus it's been a great field for me to be part of and reporting on for the last 40 years in introductory psych texts. And it's supported by a spirit of humility that understands that I might be wrong. And this is what undergirds the whole scientific attitude. It's a spirit of curiosity that's always wondering about things. Does it work? If I put it to the test, can its predictions be confirmed? If I test seasonal affective disorder on Google Trends, will I find it or not? I mean, so you ask those questions. It's a certain spirit of skepticism, always asking somebody. It's not cynicism. It's not denying other people's truth, but it wants to know, what do you mean? How do you know? What's the evidence? I mean, your intuition tells you that. You've observed that. But do the data support that? and humility, being willing to be surprised and to follow new ideas. Things don't always turn out how we expect, and thus, as we've seen, sometimes we're surprised. What do we want? We want evidence-based science, therefore. When do we want it? After peer review. This is great thing to have a demonstration of. And it turns out the good news is that for educators like myself, is that education works. People who are educated are less vulnerable to misinformed conspiracy theories, for example. Across the political spectrum, educated thinkers are better at evaluating evidence, and thus we're admonished to focus on increasing basic science literacy and critical thinking. And I'd like to think by studying psychological science, we can develop our critical thinking capacity. We can increase our sense of wonder and respect for the human creature. I'm going to be back here on Wednesday talking about kind of some just amazing phenomena related to the hearing human system, and as well as the challenges related to hearing. I arise in the morning torn between a desire to save the world and a desire to savor the world. I want to save the world from kind of misinformation, but I also want to savor the wonders of our humanity. And it's just going to skip there because I thought those slides weren't there. So let's teach the importance of replication. Let's encourage critical thinking. And let's be reassured, I tell my teaching colleagues, that our evidence-derived principles of human behavior are definitely worth teaching as we help our students appreciate their wonderful world. And now I'd be glad to take on your questions about anything I've said or about our process of creating educational materials for college students and high school AP students.
Whoever thought that psychology could be fun? It was very entertaining.
Yes, you're gonna.
I have a question. How do you explain your denial of seasonal affective disorder when considering one of the original slides you showed saying that depression could be cured with light therapy?
It's a very good question. And in fact, I've noted that in my in the correspondence I've had with my editors and my co-author, because that's a data point that's certainly consistent with the idea that darkness of wintertime can be alleviated by light therapy. But that's not just true in wintertime. The light therapy can work at other times than December and January too. Still, that's a very good point. And so but then I'm left with the CDC data and the Google Trends data, which point me to a different result.
Also on the Google Trends data, could you look instead, search for vacations to Florida, Nevada, and Arizona?
Right. Yeah. I'm sure that would be seasonally related. Right.
Other questions?
Thank you. This isn't a question so much as just I don't know, an admission that I have admired you from afar for a long time. I taught psychology in high school.
Oh,
And
where?
Godwin Heights, outside
Okay.
of Grand Rapids,
Is it AP or regular psych?
regular psych.
Okay.
The only reason I taught psychology was because I was a psych major for about a year and a half in college, and I had more psych background than any other social studies teacher. But I had a dearth of material. I had an outdated textbook. I wasn't allowed to buy a new textbook because it was a one-off class and it wasn't MEP tested, so it wasn't deemed important. I went to Grand Valley. They were using your textbook and they kindly gave me one of your textbooks, the teacher's edition, and also a whole binder of activities and stories about experiences like the split brain experiences and so on. And it was a lifeline for me, and it made psychology fun. It was by far the most fun class I ever taught. And the kids agreed. And of course we could cover so much with human development and sexuality, and we could answer questions or at least reframe them for kids that they had no place else to go to. And I appreciate the research that you've done and the accessibility that you have have added to psychology. And it was a lifesaver for me. So thank you. And it's an honor to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dana. It's very kind of you. And I should say, a lot of the pedagogical materials that led to this book being so widely adopted in high school AP classes and college and universities were created by people other than myself. And as a team of actually Hope and Calvin professors, I authored the book. My colleague, Tom Ludwig, created computer simulations that won national and international awards as the best computer software for the teaching introductory psychology. Martin Bolt in the psychology department at Calvin created our instructor resources with all the class demonstrations, and John Brink in the psych department at Calvin created the test bank. So I would often say I love Calvin 362 days a year, and I hate it. I hate it as much as Danny does. 3 days. Yeah.
Okay, you explained the effect of the phone on teens. What is the effect of the phone on adults?
Oh, the same, but lesser, but lesser effect. And so there's been some increase in adult mental health issues, but nothing like what's happened with kids. And so it's just a much more modest effect. And that's why the concern is about America's teens. And that's where the biggest effects are seen. Over there.
Right here.
Where are we?
Right.
Oh,
here.
there. Okay.
Yeah. The predicament that this teacher found himself in, scrambling for materials. Elementary teachers are given basals to teach kids reading with
All right.
that have no research behind them.
Oh, yeah.
And I wondered if you're familiar or you ever heard of Project Follow Through.
No, and so I am aware from the teaching of reading, it's a whole area of research and kind of the expert understanding of how you best teach reading to kids has changed and evolved over time, hasn't it?
Well, actually, I'm a school psychologist, retired.
Okay.
But I was trained at Western in the 70s, and the results of Project Follow Through, it was initiated by Lyndon Johnson because he wanted to know how we could best lift disadvantaged kids out of
Right.
their situation. And so 75,000 kids were subjected to about 12 different types of early reading instruction. And one of them came out far and above effective, and the others did not. That information has been suppressed all these years. Yeah, I would encourage you to look for about, it's in Wikipedia, anybody can look for it.
Right.
And right now, Senator Jeff Irwin in Ann Arbor has sponsored a bill that passed the Senate to fund the identification of dyslexia. And you alluded to the fact that there's no evidence for auditory processing or visual processing techniques that are going to teach kids better. And so the kids would be identified and then money put into teacher training to help these dyslexic kids. And I'm very much afraid that more good money is going to be poured after bad and never look at the research that was done. And this program continues to work across the country. If anybody wants to look, if you want to teach your grandkids, go to phonics.com, FUNNIX.com. Teach your child to read in 100 easy lessons. It works individually.
So again, let me just say, the teaching of reading to elementary students is outside my wheelhouse, but the idea of assessing different possibilities with systematic research in a genuine large-scale social experiment is the right thing to do, and then to listen to that result. Neighbor.
Yes, I just wanted to end this today because I taught AP Psych as well, and I taught out of Dr. Meyers' book. And I wanted to tell you all that we raised the number of classes in Hudsonville High School from like 2 to 8 because it's such a wonderful textbook that the students really like. But I have a little story. I get to chapter 7. I'm reading chapter 7, and you don't know this, all of you, but Dr. Meyers played what I always called old man basketball at Hope with my husband. And I get to chapter 7, and he writes this. Do you know what I'm going to say? He writes this little story where I forget what the topic was, but it was something like, I'm going to take the basketball down the court, but I know I'm going to get intercepted by Peter. And I say to my students, that is my husband.
It was.
So he is eternal. And I want to thank you for giving
Yeah,
me
yeah.
great cred with my students, because we were in the
it was.
books.
That was, but part of the fun of authoring a text is you can slip in pictures of people you love or stories or anecdotes where you need illustrations. And that was a true life illustration. Peter Berkey was a really tough defensive player. It was in my face constantly. And so I made reference to Peter in the book, not knowing that Lynn was going to end up using it in there.
Could you say a little bit more about the value or lack thereof for critical incident debriefing on trauma victims?
Oh, well,
You
yeah.
said it was I
Yeah,
don't know
it's
if
just that-
surprising or unsurprising, but
Yeah. So this clinical research is not something I have deep expertise in. However, the available research has led to the general consensus that it doesn't work. And so it's not worth doing. And my understanding, but again, I don't pretend to be an expert here, is that when you have people rehearse and relive terrible experiences, that's not terribly helpful. In fact, if anything, they need for that memory to subside rather than to be reactivated and kind of have the trauma relived. And so that may be the reason why critical incident debriefing has not been found effective, even though it's very well intentioned.
A number of questions from home. I appreciate your information about the lack of influence on parenting, especially compared to the influence of peers. You steered me toward this decades ago. My question is, do you perceive ways in which parents might veer from established parenting culture to more positively help their children develop capacities for psychologically successful later life?
Well, one way in which parents, if I'm addressing the question, could help their children be successful, John Haidt, my friend, would strongly recommend is trust them more, allow them more free play. There's a national movement. It's called Let's Grow. If you could Google Let's Grow. That says, kids are less at risk of being taken or molested or whatever than you think. And the harm that's done by overprotecting children is greater than the risk of harm by letting them roam the neighborhood and have free play with other kids. So John is a great advocate of, he lives in New York City, and he's one to let his kids on the subway system, at a fairly early age, and to navigate life and to take out, go to a bank and establish their own bank account and have the kind of experiences that many of us had as kids that today's kids are kind of protected from. And he thinks that's one thing parents could do, is give their children more freedom to experience the vicissitudes of life, including the hurts of life, without being overly protected from having to deal with hurts and harms and then cope with that. That's part of maturing. That's part of building emotional resilience, is having bad experiences and learning to deal with that.
Another question. Another question from home. If repression of trauma doesn't occur, then what explains reports that childhood traumas can't be forgotten until something is triggered later in life?
Okay, could you repeat the question? Did you hear the question?
No.
Okay, I'm going to put you on a different setting here. Go ahead.
Okay, this is about your notion that repression of trauma doesn't occur. And the person is asking, what explains then the reports that childhood traumas can be forgotten until something is triggered later in life? This occurs to happen in therapy, but can also occur other times.
Oh, thank you. So now I hear the question. And in fact, Elizabeth Loftus, a colleague, a friend of mine who's done much of this research on false memories, is one who has testified in many court cases to say that many of those memories of later, that are drawn out under therapy, coaching people to recall experiences of parental abuse or of caregiver abuse early in childhood that they've repressed for all these years and never remembered. What they're doing is creating false memories. And there's been a lot of people wrongly accused and families broken up and relationships harmed. And that's been therapy at its very worst. If you have a horrific experience, again, you're not likely to forget it. Now, there's some children that may be abused, but it's at such an early age that they don't remember anything from that age. And so they just don't remember it later. It's not that they've repressed it, but it's just that memory doesn't consolidate until you're, sometime after the age of 4. So I guess the general answer to that question by the people doing the research is that there's been a lot of false accusations of parents and teachers and preschool teachers of abuse that never actually, there's no evidence that it ever happened except in the mind of the person that had it created it under the influence of a therapist who believed that childhood abuse is the source of adult depression.
I have a question about, you said there were 3 things that work as therapy. I was surprised about the ECT. As a young nurse, I witnessed a patient receiving ECT and saw the patient's response. Have things drastically changed?
Well, just again, we're always talking odds. So what are the odds of recovery? And so it's just that for people who are intractably depressed and for whom other forms of therapy, cognitive therapy and drug therapy have not been effective, electroconvulsive therapy often is very effective. Sometimes it needs to be repeated some months or years later. By the way, one example, and this is, we're both talking anecdotes here, and the plural of the anecdote is not data. And again, we want data of the sort that was alluded to in that reading study. My recently deceased John Shaughnessy, I don't think would mind my telling you, became profoundly depressed and was disabled and could not teach for, you remember John, and drug therapy, nothing worked. And he finally submitted himself to ECT, and it was like the lights came on. I mean, he was like, suddenly he was himself again. Now, it does eliminate memory for a certain number of weeks before the therapy happens. And one of the things that he got back to the office and he realized he was behind schedule to start work on a new edition of his research methods textbook. And he opened the drawer and there was the work, substantially underway. And it was the most wonderful discovery that his memory for it had been wiped out, but it was there. Anyway, so I would say in general, to use a pun, it's shockingly effective.
I have a friend whose daughter recently had 12 treatments, and she was in a very bad way prior to that. But my friend's questioning, will she have short-term memory deficits?
Oh, yeah.
Will they consist for a long time?
No, she'll form memories again. Again, I'm not an expert here. I'm a social psychologist. But for the weeks preceding that therapy, she's going to lose a lot of memory. I mean, it's going to wipe out some recent experiences, but not her distant past. All her abilities, all her knowledge will be intact, and she'll be fine going forward, forming new memories. Again, it's not 100% effective, but it's like, would I recommend a child or somebody I love try it if nothing else worked? The answer is yes, I would, based on the data. Do I know why it works? No, and that's the weird thing about it. I mean, I can use an analogy. It's like rebooting your computer, when nothing's working and suddenly it works. And I don't know what the difference is, but that's not an explanation.
Is the administration of the ECT any different than it was decades ago?
Oh, yes, it is. So it's much less convulsive now. So it's much more localized. But again, that's something for a physician.
There are many schools at this point where kids are asked to turn in their phones when they
Oh, yeah.
enter school.
Correct.
Is it going to have any real effect since they go home and there's their phone?
Right. So that's something that John Haidt strongly advocates, and it's been done in many schools now in the United Kingdom and increasingly in the United States. And it can be done in a couple of ways. One, a very common way is there's a pouch, a locked pouch that you deposit your phone in when you arrive at school. And at the end of the school day, those pouches are all unlocked so the kids can collect their phones on the way out. They're still going to be using their phones the rest of the day. As soon as they get on a school bus, they're going to be like this rather than talking to their friends. You can almost guarantee it. And that's not great. However, during the school day, teachers aren't going to have to contend with people being on phones when they're supposed to be paying attention to what's happening in class. During recess, and during lunch, they're going to be talking with other kids rather than staring at their phones. I, not long ago, lectured in a 75-minute class at the college, and it had a break in the middle. And I noticed it is supposed to be a time when you can go to the bathroom and get to know other people. And I noticed everybody just stayed in their seats and pulled out their phone like this. And I commented to the instructor, that is so sad. I mean, people aren't getting to know each other. And so it's a really big deal, and schools should be doing that. And it's a whole movement in the United States now. Schools are moving to this, and I would expect to see it before long in Holland and West Ottawa schools.
My grandson goes to school in Britain, and they've been doing this for some time.
Yeah, and Britain is ahead of us in this.
But it was interesting that he had a geography final that the kids were told to review some other stuff. And then when they got to the final, it was basically on Britain. And he said, I flunked something about where Norwich is. And his mother said, we go through Norwich every weekend on our way to Norfolk. Why do you not know where Norwich is? It's because he was on his phone.
Ah, no kidding.
One back there.
A quick question. And David, in the introduction, it said that you've been doing your thing at Hope since 1867. I mean, 1967.
Right.
Sorry.
I tell people, hey, I'm not as old as I look.
Yeah, no kidding.
I'm only 81.
Oh, wow. Look at that. You got some good stuff. And I guess that's the question. What's your secret sauce? How do you keep doing what you're doing?
So partly it's a question of what else would I do? And so I have 3 children. They all live thousands of miles away, either on the West Coast or in South Africa. So I have no grandchildren or children around. I love going to Hope basketball, as you guys do. But what else? And okay, that's kind of the negative answer. The positive answer is I am given the opportunity to teach life relevant, values related information to millions of people. I mean, hundreds of thousands per year, to 80% of high school AP students and so forth. And to take what we're doing at Hope and to export it to a much larger world, and with philanthropic out consequences that is a mere side effect. And to keep learning something new every day and reporting on that. So just when I go back to my office today, I'm going to be finishing an essay for my blog, talkpsych.com, and sending it off to my editor for kind of the beginning of the editorial process. Stuff that's really interesting, fascinating, that if we had more time, I'd love to tell you about. But that's, I get to do that. And so learning something new every day, having the opportunity to teach to an unseen world audience in many languages, and then to have to figure out what to do with all the money that generates is like it's like a great privilege. And so and again, but it's not just me. The pack is greater than the wolf. I mean, so there's a whole team of people that make this happen, and I'm just the quarterback on the team. So maybe
David Glad, is there anything else on that? Okay, guys, it is past 11. How interested are you in continuing 2 more?
I can hang around if anybody wants to.
Okay.
So
Microphone here.
I'm wondering if you are familiar with The Body Keeps the Score
Yeah, by Basil.
by,
Yeah,
yeah,
guy at Harvard.
yeah, A Brain, Mind and Body and the Healing of Trauma by
Right,
Vanderkock.
right, yeah. So I've not read the book, but I'm aware of him. He's a Harvard psychiatrist, and it's been a very popular, very widely read book about how traumas are kind of internalized in the body, so forth. So again, I don't have any expertise to speak to that.
Hi. When I was fresh out of college and an idealist, I worked for a juvenile court. And I thought our juvenile court had so many programs that was making a difference. I mean, we had a shelter home and a detention home and child psychologists. And the most important to me was the Big Brothers program. I
Right.
thought if Big Brothers could really, really work, if more of these people would get out and be Big Brothers, we could really make a difference to at-risk kids. But as it was, going from being a abused and neglected children, it's just an age difference to get to be a juvenile delinquent. And I'm wondering if juvenile courts or child services have, because you're talking about kids who really have been neglected and abused and not nurtured. Is there anything juvenile court or other services can do for those kids that does make a difference?
Again, you're outside my wheelhouse. I mean, this would be a kind of a social work research question. I would say the research I'm just briefly alluded to on wise interventions and on changing at-risk kids' mindset to think about how developing their abilities and characters like developing a muscle. There are things you can do to make a difference. If you can inculcate that belief, it sometimes could bend the twig this way or that way. Second thing is there's a lot of large-scale, well-intentioned efforts to change people, because there's a lot of hurting people and a lot of good people that want to make a difference. So trying to think, the preschool readiness program here in Holland, for example, would be one such effort that's trying to catch kids very young and put them on a better path. So our family foundation contributes to that. Do I know that it's making a long-term difference in increasing the graduation rates and the ultimate life experience of those kids? I don't really know. There are more kids in preschool programs now than there used to be. A lot of the big corporations are supporting this preschool readiness program. So I don't know, but at least I know this. The preschool years are part of life. And if those preschool kids are having a better life and a better experience as preschool kids, that's got inherent value in itself. And so, I'll take a risk. And
that was why I believed so much in the Big Brothers program. I really believed if a healthy, well-adjusted person could have some exposure.
Right.
I guess that's nurturing.
Right.
Might be too late, but.
Yeah. Exactly. And so we got programs at Hope. I mean, I just had breakfast with a whole flood of, I don't know whether they're Upward Bound or whatever, kids came in, and it's like, whatever happens to those kids, they're being given a great experience right now, today, right across the street at Hope College. They're having educational experiences and their horizons are being expanded. And are they going to make more money as 40-year-olds? I mean, I can't tell you that they are, but today, June 17th or whatever, they're having a good experience.
Anything else?
Okay. Thank you.